everybody, to our first lecture, and we will, as is appropriate, we will begin at the beginning. Introduction to Emergency Medical Care Systems, Research and Public Health. I want to say a couple of things before we get too far into this. I am going to try very hard to keep these short, if possible.
Sure, Jan.
Or short as I can. There's a lot of material here, and I have to be careful not to digress too much to go too deeply into it. I will try very hard to put resources up there for your reading so that these things aren't, 6 days long just to get through one lesson. And this, of course, is your textbook up here. I don't have your textbook in front of me right at the moment. I have it on my desktop, a digital copy. I've got so much stuff opened up for reference as I go through this that I want to point out to you, most of which will probably end up on your Moodle page for it to be linked to so you can look at it for yourself. One of the things we try to do, and we need to do, is not teach you just what to do in a situation or try to do in a situation, and not to teach you what to think. It's to teach you how to think. So I put stuff up there that I've referenced or whatever so that if you wish you can go and read it and draw your own conclusions. I really don't have a problem if you have a different opinion than I do about a certain concept. Now, if you have a different opinion as to what drug to give for supraventricular tachycardia, we're going to have a problem because there's not much opinion based there right now, at least not for our purposes. There's not. But I just said supraventricular tachycardia. This is the EMT class. We won't go too deeply into that here. You don't have to worry about the drug for that because EMTs don't give it, but paramedics do, and you are in a paramedic program. So I want to say this about your book. It's a good book. Is it a perfect book? No, I haven't ever seen a perfect book. Don't expect to see a perfect book. You can start a lively discussion, get 4 or 5 EMS instructors in a room and start tossing out different books, and you can get a lively discussion going about, one will like this one will like the other one. All of us have pet subjects, things that we think need to be emphasized more in a textbook, things that need to be in there that aren't even in there, really, a lot of times. And some things we disagree with when they're stated in the book. I'll say this about that, to be fair. This is a national standard book that people all over the United States, and the world for that matter, frequently use in their classes. And if someone was to write a textbook that's going to address every possibility that you're going to face out there, well, I know you couldn't carry it. I don't even know where you'd store it. I don't think there's a warehouse big enough to put it in there, and it probably would never be finished because people keep finding new and inventive ways of getting themselves into trouble for us to get them out of. So read your text. Your test questions will come from the text. I'm also let you in on another dirty little secret before I move on, and that is, if you don't, I didn't require you to get the workbook. I usually don't. However, you might find it to your benefit to get the workbook and do the exercises in the workbook, because I have noticed something. I noticed it a few years back, that a lot of the test questions off the test bank that comes with this package, it comes with this textbook, actually came out of the workbook. These next few slides, I'm going to go very quickly because they're just what we're going to be talking about, and I may edit these out. I don't know. They're not really. It does tell you your EMS Education Standards text, page 1, your chapter objectives on text, page 1. This is what we're seeking to learn. It's in your book, and the key terms. Key terms might be worth looking over. On that, I'm a long-time EMS person. Been doing this for a bazillion years, and we in EMS are a lot like our friends in the military, in that we love jargon, we love acronyms, and we throw them out there like they're common knowledge. And as a student, they may not be common knowledge to you. Please, if I do that, let me know. I try not to do it, but I'm just human. So if I do, don't let me lose you on that. I guess I should touch on the purpose of lecture presentation versus textbook reading assignments. We're in the midst of a COVID deal. I'm working very hard to get these lectures done because it may be that we are operating on some type of modified schedule and be doing our lessons online. So I don't want you to worry about that because I'm also thinking about doing some live classes, some live remote classes, where we can maybe go to meeting or some other platform out there rather than doing everything online. I'm sorry, I keep hitting that mic, and I know if you got a headset on, it's probably blowing your ears out. I would rather do that than put videos online because you can interact with me that way. The purpose of a lecture, because theoretically, guys, you got a textbook, and you have something else that I never had when I was a student, which is the internet. We used to have to, if we wanted to research, we had to go to this building called a library. If you don't know what that is, it contained things called books, and they had paper pages, and you had to sit down and search the index and find what you were looking for, and you had to dig up sources, walk around the building. I'm half joking. I know you probably know what a library is. Your kids probably won't, but you you do. I can give you a subject, and you can go on the web and just find mountains of information on that subject, which is good and it's bad. The availability is wonderful. You also have to be kind of discerning because some of the information is bad. Some of the videos I've seen posted, some of the shortcuts I've seen posted have inherent weaknesses to them that aren't addressed in the video. In other words, they'll try to show you the tricks of the trade without showing you the trade, and I'd rather you learn the trade before you learn the tricks. But a lecture gives you perspective. If I've got nothing else, I've got perspective. I've been doing it a long time. I've seen a lot of things. A lot of the things we're going to talk about in this first unit, I've actually lived through. I saw the results of them. And I will try hard not to editorialize on those. I may slip up. I don't know. We'll see. I also have to see one of the reasons it takes me so long to make these videos is because after I make them, I have to go back and edit them. A whole lot of my digressions and editorializing gets cut because I don't want to, poison you with my subversive thoughts. At least not yet. We've got plenty of time for that. So you need a lecture. You can learn a lot from the textbook, but you need some of the topics. You need some context. You need some perspective on how they actually work in real life. This is what we're going to study in this chapter, and I'll go over them very quickly. The emergency medical services system, the emergency medical technician, how it came to be. A lot of things had to come together for you to be sitting here watching this. And I'll go ahead and tell you, when it comes to the history of EMS, which is part of this unit, I'm going to link to a video that another college made. Not because it's an excellent show. My hat's off to them for doing it. But if I do it, that'll be the rest of the quarter. I'm a history nut. You will find that about me. I love history. The history of anything I find interesting to fascinating, depending on what it is. And I don't think I would do the history of EMS justice because I would have to skip over a lot of things that I think are important. So I'm going to link to that. I will talk a little about the history, but I won't talk very much about it because we'll get lost in it. I know me. EMS system organization and standards. We're going to talk about EMS research. Probably a reasonably new concept in EMS. For a lot of years, we didn't do much research. Nobody was interested in doing EMS research, and now we're doing a lot of it, and it's helped us a whole lot. We'll talk about that a little bit. Evidence-based guidelines. I love that word. What that means is what we say or what we believe to be the right course of action is based on evidence. It's based on fact. We've looked at these cases and we've come to the conclusion that this is the best way of doing things. For many, many years, we did things that were, they seemed right. They looked to be right, but there was absolutely no evidence to back up that they were. And we've subsequently found a lot of our practices. I think back on some of the things we did back when I started, and not many, but a lot of them we found out are just not effective. Well, I'm starting to drift off and want to lecture on that right now, and so I'll move on. Public health. Our role in public health is growing, and it's going to continue to grow, I believe. There's some obstacles to that growth. We'll talk about those a little bit. And mobile integrated healthcare and community paramedicine, which kind of goes in with the previous one in public health. We are moving into community paramedicine. The concept is sound. It's a little murky, but it's sound. It's having some trouble getting off the ground. I'll talk to you about why that is, because I think it's an inherently good thing. But it's got some pretty big hurdles it's going to have to overcome, and we'll talk about what those are. The case studies, I'm going to leave this one up. In some of these lectures, I will skip the case studies. I probably should skip this one. It's very basic. It is, but then again, we're at the introductory level of the course. So we got a guy named Ben Melton. He's got diabetes, and he's overweight, about 40 pounds. I feel your pain, buddy, after this quarantine. All I've done is sit in front of a computer and eat, and I'm going to have to get my butt back out to running or doing something, or I'm not going to make it myself. I don't have diabetes, though. He's 51 years old, and he just loves a big old fat, high cholesterol, high carbohydrate, good old-fashioned breakfast of eggs, steak, and fried potatoes. He just loves them to death. And he goes into his favorite breakfast spot and sits down and gets coffee, and then he's not feeling well. And his friend Arnie looks at him and says, "Man, you don't look good. You're pale and you're sweating." And Ben collapses on the floor. He pulls the tablecloth off, which makes the waitress really upset because she's got to clean that mess up. But he falls to the floor. And this case study is asking us to think about some things. What components of a healthcare system must be in place for Ben to receive immediate help? At this point, we're not worried about exactly what's going on. I can think of several things that might be going on that could cause it. You know, I know where they're pointing me, but I also know I can think of a lot of things that would cause old Ben to take a header on the floor. What weaknesses in a system could decrease Ben's chances of getting help? Now, this is for you to think about. And you can do this. Take a moment, pause the video, and think about what would it take to get Ben the help he needs. It seems so basic. Oh yeah, this is boring. No, if you stop and think about what needs to happen, because let's parse that text very accurately. What components of a healthcare system must be in place for Ben to receive immediate help, not just eventually? And if I'd have wrote this, I would have put immediate, appropriate help for what's causing them. A lot of things have to be in place for that to happen. Things that we take for granted today, but weren't always there, and they're still developing. What weaknesses in a system could decrease Ben's chances of getting help? The flip side of the first question: what do you need to have, and what can get in the way? So give that a little thought. I'm sure we'll be coming back to it. This particular slide probably in some ways could serve as a summary of why you're here. The last line, EMTs can make a positive difference. That's kind of almost British in its understatement value. EMTs can make a heck of a difference. Sudden loss of life and disability from catastrophic accidents and illnesses is a major public health problem. It is, it was, it always will be. We get better, cars are safer, but people still die in them. The amount of freak accidents, weird things that happen, industrial accidents, farm accidents, household accidents that we respond to, that's just one of those things that it's almost maddening. If it went just slightly in another direction, they wouldn't have ended up the way they did. But that's what we deal with. Thousands of people die or suffer permanent harm yearly because of lack of access to adequate EMS. And I also find this to be a true statement. And we have a vast array of types of EMS system, and some of them are fantastic and some of them are borderline non-functional. I'll come back to speak more about that as we go on into EMS systems as to why that might be. But EMS varies from county to county in North Carolina and from state to state in the United States and across the world. Don't really see a need to beat this slide up. What happens to an injured patient or an ill patient before they ever get to the hospital can make a critical difference. We're getting into the history of EMS, and I so would love to delve deeply into a deep dive in it, but that would take a lot of time. As I said, I'm going to link a video that will hit the high spots. I will touch on a few things here, and I may equate them to some things, particularly as it relates to North Carolina. We saw EMS, the roots of EMS, we saw them start to mature, really, in the Korean and Vietnam Wars. A lot of the aspects, particularly in Vietnam, that would come to be part of the modern EMS delivery system, EMS theory, if you'll allow me, started in Korea and Vietnam. In Korea, probably the most, everybody, if you're not familiar, I know people are a lot younger, you're a lot younger than me. You may not be familiar with the TV show MASH. It's a great show. I still love it. Watch it every once in a while. I don't watch a lot of TV, but if I happen to be passing by the TV and it's on, I'm likely to watch it. It was a mobile hospital, a mobile surgical unit, actually. And they used helicopters to fly these soldiers and ambulances. They used ambulances as well, but the more critical will be picked up by chopper and flown back to these MASH units, which were usually somewhere between 1 and 3 miles behind the lines. And it got these patients care quicker. It got them to a care of a physician quicker. Getting someone who is critically ill or injured to a physician quicker was one of the, especially early, tenets of EMS. As a matter of fact, in the earliest days of modern EMS, that was probably where the emphasis was. And I'll tell you, there are still situations where that is where the emphasis has to be. There is nothing wrong. As a matter of fact, one of the things I expect you to know before you get out of here is when you're over your head, when you've got a problem that you just can't fix, and the best thing you can do is expedite the transport to the people who can, who have the equipment and the expertise to manage a patient when you're out of your depth. In Vietnam, IV therapy in the field, as well as helicopter transport. You had medics that went out with the troops, and they would actually start, and IV, sometimes plasma, in the field, led to amazing survivability rates. Survivability had increased a whole lot on the battlefield. As compared to like the Civil War. Civil War had an ambulance corps. Civil War had field hospitals. And the problem was the soldier had to pretty much self-extricate. If you weren't well enough to walk back to the aid station or the field hospital, you weren't getting out of there. So Vietnam, these were radical, really, at the time. Nobody really thought about it, and somebody started thinking, hey, maybe we can do something like this back home. That's a very oversimplified version of what happened, but it's essentially true. These things we learned in war. As a matter of fact, a lot of what we do, a lot of our equipment got its baptism on the battlefield. A lot of our methods, a lot of our philosophy, or our theory, again, if you will, came from the battlefield. Because it was a situation where you needed to get people to help quickly. They were critical and they needed help quickly. Medics in Vietnam were actually trained. I mean, they were in World War II too, but they were actually trained to do invasive things to keep someone alive until they could be flown back to help or driven back to help. It's really funny to me because I was talking about Vietnam and Korea. While this stuff was going on foreign battlefields, back home, we were making great strides in medicine, particularly in coronary care. We'll talk a little bit more about that. Actually, I should go ahead and I'll cut to the chase and tell you that trauma was the mother of EMS. And if you talk about the history, it was trauma that the National Traffic Highway Safety Administration was trying to combat automobile accidents, trauma, which led to the formation of the EMT, the first standards, the first training standards for equipment, the first standards for equipment, the first standards for training, all came from the Department of Transportation. But we still really weren't thinking outside the box as opposed to illness and even trauma. We were deficient. We were very deficient. We could do great things for you in a hospital in the 60s. The only problem was you had to get to the hospital alive. As a matter of fact, there was a study done. It was part of the next bullet here, part of the EMS white paper. It informed it. One of the things they talked about when they were coming up with it was that in America at that time, 60% of the people who had a heart attack in a hospital would survive. But the problem was only 40% of the people who had a heart attack had one in the hospital. So if you just happened to be strolling by a hospital and had a heart attack, you were in pretty good shape. If you were anywhere else, you were in trouble. In 1966, the white paper, you'll hear about this. It was actually a study. It was a report called Accidental Death and Disability. That's not all of it, but that's the meat of it. And it laid out a lot of startling things. The white paper actually was geared predominantly toward trauma. As I said, it was about highway accidents. People were dying on the highways, and they were looking for ways to improve survivability. But that white paper was very important to us. It focused attention on this problem of trauma on the highways and laid the groundwork for that we could proceed from to form the EMT. Modern EMS as part of the greater continuum of care is an idea that's really nice on paper, and it's an idea that we are aspiring to. To say we have achieved it across the board, I think, is a stretch. It basically means that EMS does not stand alone, and it shouldn't. It never should have stood alone. You got EMS, and then you have the continuum of hospital care. EMS should be part of that continuum of care. I'm not going to get into why that. I mean, I could give you 1,000 reasons why I think that's always been the case. We've had a hard time working ourselves into the continuum of care. Part of it's we didn't want to, and part of it is we weren't going to be accepted by the rest of the medical community. It's better than it was in that respect, but ideally, modern EMS should be part of the continuum of care that begins at the scene and continues through hospital discharge and rehabilitation. A lot was happening in the 60s. It really was. A lot of things in a lot of areas, but particularly in medicine. CPR was introduced in the 60s. It took hold. It was so simple and yet so could be effective. It saved lives, and people were being trained in it. And people were still looking at ways to improve survivability across the board. But one big problem that was going on was a lot of people were dying on the highways. About 49,000, I think, if my memory serves. You can look that up if you want to. I'm not going to. I'm almost sure it was about 49,000 in 1965, the year before the white paper was published, which led to the Highway Safety Act of 1966. The Highway Safety Act of 1966 actually established, let me adjust this mic, established the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, we call it NHTSA, within the Department of Transportation. And it did a lot of things. It sets safety standards for cars, for one thing, was part of it. But as far as it relates to us, NHTSA was charged with improving EMS systems by administering grants for ambulance purchases, communication systems, training programs. If you were going to do that, you had to come up with a training program. You had to come up with some basic standards. Well, the Highway Safety Act of 66 did that. As an aside, I will tell you that one of the things that this study that led up to the National Highway Safety Act of 66 found was that a large number of people were actually injured worse by their rescuers than by the accident itself. So, it was bad enough you've been in an accident, now you had to survive your rescuer. So that was one of the things that they were seeking to change. 1967 in North Carolina, this is not your textbook, but in North Carolina, the legislature passed the Ambulance Services Act, which basically told counties that they could contract with ambulance services or establish their own. And many counties established their own, many contracted, mostly with funeral home services. But that's not your text. Let's stick to it. I'm not going to go there. I'll get lost. That brings us to the EMS System Act of 1973. This was very important because it provided funding for the development of EMS systems, EMS regions, block funding for regions across the nation. There was a lot of money involved in that. I did know how much, and I've forgotten. I'm not going to look it up. But a lot of money was spent out there, and it was tasked with funding for the development of regional EMS systems and authorized a program of research in emergency medical techniques, method, and devices. At this point in time, the federal government had been very involved in the development of EMS. They were, we had, 2 acts within a decade that spent money nationally on EMS. Now, your next slide skips up to 1993, but before we get there, I would like to mention that in the 80s, those block grants were folded into another program, the Omnibus program, and instead of being earmarked for EMS, they were turned over to states and regions as just for health care. And when they did that, guess who didn't get the money anymore? The money that was had been earmarked for EMS was now being funneled into other things. And really the federal government just kind of abandoned EMS throughout the decade of the 80s. But there was no more federal money put into the development of EMS. And it's safe to say that EMS stalled. It began to stagnate. And in a very real sense, it was at this point that the profession fragmented. And one of the reasons, even to this day, we have so much variance in virtually everything, in scope of practice, in delivery model, and you name it. There's not a lot of uniformity. Now, it seems to me, and this is just an observation, it seems to me like what we're trying to do today is trying to corral that back in to try to regain that momentum. We've been trying for many, many years. I don't know how well we've done, but we're trying to gain the momentum of getting it back under some type of unifying standard. And I think we've made some strides toward that. I think eventually they will. I see it happening. It's just not, in my opinion, happened yet. The National Emergency Services Education and Practice Blueprint 93, National Register of EMT, really was an attempt to standardize what EMTs could do, what they should learn, and what they could do. I'm on take 4 of this slide, trying to figure out what I should say, how much I should say, because you literally could do a 3-hour lecture on these 4 topics and what they meant, or what they intended to mean. Let's put it that way. And I mentioned that up until the 80s, the federal government had been deeply involved in the growth of EMS, and in kind of the 80s, we just kind of like lost it. They relegated money that had been earmarked to EMS to a general health thing, and of course EMS was not the highest priority for the powers that be at the time, so EMS got relegated to the states and to the counties. But NHTSA, National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, inside the Department of Transportation, the EMS office, which is a very, very minuscule part of a huge government federal agency, they tried very hard. They've done some great research, and they've put out some position papers, and a lot of these, that's what these are. This is the position that they take as to what EMS is and should be going forward. And there was a lot of them. The NHTSA never stopped. The 96 Agenda for the Future, I remember when it came out. I remember reading it for the first time. Big document. And I remember thinking at the time, this is great. I don't think it occurred to me at the time of the how we were going to do this, that they wanted to do. But I thought, well, this is great. If the people who actually pull the strings get behind it, this will be a big step up for EMS. And what it said basically was what I'd said earlier, that EMS should be part of the greater health continuum. It shouldn't be a standalone thing doing its own thing separate from the rest of the medical continuum. And it said a lot more than that, but if you boil it, as we say in the country, you boil it down to gravy, that's what it was. It was saying that this is how EMS should think. It should think as part of a continuum. It should always be evaluating what it does and selecting things that are actually helpful and are evidence-based and things like that. The next three on this list, the Education Agenda for the Future, the National Core Content, and the National Scope of Practice Model, basically two of them are philosophies as to how we should look at the core content of EMS education, of EMS training, and what it should focus on. And this is why I'm having so much trouble. This is why I'm going to take number 4 or 5, I can't remember, I think it's 4, trying to get through it, because while these documents are important, they're still valid. They're presented here as if we've accomplished them, and we haven't. We haven't. We've accomplished some aspects of some of them. We've accomplished, we've moved it a little closer to what these things want, but there is no real teeth. Since the federal government's not spending the money, since the states and the counties are spending the money, it's very difficult to put all of these things into practice that they advocate. And what I'm going to do, I'm going to link to a couple of documents, and you can read every one of these for yourself. I will warn you, it's not the most exciting reading. I would venture to say it would stand as a good cure for insomniacs who don't respond to strong medications. But there is some good material in there. I kind of touched on one of the problems that I have with them. We put out these papers and say, oh, these are great. And I agree with everything in them. But one thing none of them address, and it's one of the most important parts, is who's footing the bill for it. I can have great aspirations as to what I want to do. If I don't have the money to put them into practice, if I don't have the capital that I need to make them happen, it's going to be very difficult to make them happen. So while the federal government continues, and we've gotten a little better, we have pulled our curriculum back a little closer, a little tighter than what it once was, and yet there's still a wide variation in standard of care and the practices across the boards. We still have a lot of variation. We still have a long way to go, is what I'm trying to say, and I'm going to leave it at that. I would recommend that you read them because I have to. I'm your teacher. Read the material that I link to. I'm not going to make you. You can find the whole document, but don't do it unless you've got plenty of time because there's a lot of material there. Continuing in the important documents vein, this one, the 2006 Institute of Medicine report, The Future of EMS Care, EMS at the Crossroads. I remember reading this one as well. It recommends some very, very good things. Common scopes of practice to allow reciprocity between states. We've seen a vast improvement of that. There are still many, many states who have their own certification process, and it's very difficult to go from one state to another to work. The national accreditation for all paramedic educational programs, this one has taken hold. I haven't done it yet, but one of the things that's on my to-do list is to get our COAMPS accreditation papers in. It's a big, big thing. We will get it. I did it at one other school. I'll do it at this one. It's not a problem. It's just a lot of paperwork. The national certification as a prerequisite for state licensure and local credentialing. This one is possibly the most contentious of all of them. Whose national certification? Because there's the National Registry. It's the oldest. It's been around the longest. But there are a lot of people that, while I love their research and love a lot of what they do for EMS, aren't really big fans of the certification process as it is. You know, I don't know that I have a problem with the national certification. I may have a teensy problem with it being the national registry. I think there should be a true agency that oversees that is, I don't know, accountable to something besides the board of directors. I could probably get behind that. I have to know who the board of directors is. But anyway, that's just my 2 cents worth. But these 3 items are actually actively being, matter of fact, of all the documents I've just showed you, this was the only one where I've seen any real progress. Any real progress. I can tell you, I've been teaching national standard curriculum classes forever, and other than medical updates, I haven't seen that much difference in the delivery. For all of the documents that have been printed, I just haven't seen a whole lot. And I was teaching long before '96, so you know, it didn't really affect things that much, not that I could see. That's why I really had a problem going over these in depth, and I can promise you there will be no test questions. I think you need to know it because it's your legacy or it's your heritage. It's not your legacy, it's your heritage. It's what you came from. You're here today because these things happened, but we're still working on some of them. We're going to talk for a minute about the 10 components of an EMS system. And this is kind of getting the stuff that you do need to know. There are 10. In order for you to say that you have an EMS system, you have to have these things. Regulation and policy, resource management, human resources and training, transportation, facilities, communications, public information education, medical direction, trauma systems, and evaluation. So here is where we begin to talk about the EMS system goals. They're pretty self-evident, but we'll spell them out anyway. Clinical quality. Of course, an EMS system should always strive to deliver the best possible care. As a matter of fact, our benchmark is correct care every time. That's what we're shooting for. We're not shooting for it some of the time or most of the time. We're shooting for it every time. It's a very, very high standard, but that has to be the one that we use. The service quality. There are some people who don't differentiate clinical quality with service quality. You could have a great little debate about the differences. Clinical quality basically refers to the medical care that you deliver. It's pure medicine. Service quality means all those other things that happen when you encounter people in the course of your profession that maybe aren't strictly speaking medical. You know, it's a sad fact. A lot of what we do, guys, even though the E in emergency medical services stands for emergency, a lot of what we do is not an emergency. It ranges from what the heck are you calling me for to they think it's an emergency, but you as a medical professional realize it's probably not an emergency, to the genuine emergency, either immediate or impending, where it's an immediate emergency or it's going to be an emergency very, very quickly. So we interact with people not always in crisis. They may think they're in crisis, or they may know they're not in crisis. We get called for a lot of reasons, some of which you'd be amazed what we get called for, that they're really not at a moment of crisis at all. Efficiency, number 3, economic efficiency. This one, to me, almost takes care of itself, and that's because I don't know of many services that have money to burn that they can waste money. EMS systems and the budgeting practices of a lot of counties make it so the economic efficiency. Matter of fact, I think probably you get more bang from your buck from EMS than virtually any other medical area. We do more with less a lot of the times. Accountability. What do I need to say about accountability? The service has to be accountable for its people, for the actions, to its people too, as well. And as an individual, you have to be accountable for your actions. It's a big responsibility being an EMT. It really is. You're taking things upon yourself. You're going to be the one to know what to do in times of crisis when everybody else is freaking out. But you have to be accountable for what you do. Improvement. I don't know of an EMS system that doesn't have a compliance officer or a quality improvement officer that looks at data and practices and trends and things like that to try to make sure that we are consistently going back to number one, clinical quality, that we're providing that. Resilience. It seems odd to say this, but even within the emergency medical services, there are different levels of system emergency. The system should not break down when crazy things happen. There need to be contingencies in place. You need to be able to continue to operate 24/7 regardless of what's going on. That sounds easy. It is not. It's not easy at all. Things can break you down. I'll tell you some stories about when I've seen that happen and almost happen a few times. Let's talk about EMS system access. We all know, it's funny to me, y'all all know 911. You grew up with it. It's always been there. Well, when I started in EMS, 911 was a rarity. Very few places had a 911 system. Every agency, police, fire, EMS, had their own telephone number. They had their own dispatch center, and you called them directly on that line, and things went from there. Now, the dispatch centers usually could communicate with each other. But, I remember they used to put them out. You'd see them on the walls beside the phone or even stuck on the phone itself. And it would have a little police car with a number. And it would have usually a red cross, which was ambulance, and a number, and a little fire truck and a number. So you'd have it by your phone there if you needed it. Now we, of course, have the 911 system. And moreover, we've got, that's what the next bullet is, enhanced 911. We're able to accept text. We're able to locate cell phones. We automatically get the number of who's calling us. So we've come a long way with 911 systems. They work very well. Back in the day when they were first being broke in, it was a trunking system, and what that means is you had call distribution centers, automated call distribution centers all throughout the country. And I will never forget, I was talking to one of our dispatchers back in the day, and it wasn't uncommon that you would get a 911 call from Baltimore, Maryland, and you were in Eden, North Carolina, because of a malfunction at the trunking center, and it routed it to them instead of routing it to where they were going to go. We had back in the day, earlier, not quite far back in the day, but we had situations where people on cell phones, in the early days of cell phones, would dial 911 and it would route them back to the city where the phone was registered. So, I lived in Asheboro and I was traveling down to Myrtle Beach and I dialed 911, it would route the 911 call back to Asheboro. These were problems that had been overcome. We don't see much of that anymore. A modern communication center, or PSAP is what they're called, is really a wonder. I have, if I can find it, I'd love to stick it in a slideshow, a picture of the dispatch center at Rockingham County EMS back in those days before 911. And it was basically, you had the tone generator, which was a keypad that you could type in to set off the tones. You had a transmitter with a microphone, a desk mic, a map, and a time clock. And a call would come in, and you would punch the time clock, and you'd push the buttons to set off the right tones. And first of all, you had to find it. You had to, look at the address on the map, because you may have to tell people how to get there. We did not have locators at all. We didn't have any of those. We didn't have Google Maps. You read a map book. And you dispatched that way as well. And one of the great qualities of a telecommunicator in those days was a knowledge of the county. because they might have to literally tell people how to get there, guide them step by step. Had it happened to me a couple of times, some little goat path in the middle of Rockingham County that I didn't know where it was, but dispatch did, thank goodness. You walk into one of these things today and it's like the bridge of the Enterprise. There's computers everywhere, and I mean, like 6 screens for each telecommunicator. They are able to key up and transmit, and they can select multiple bands, simulcast on many different frequencies. It really is an amazing thing, the modern PSAP, how far it's come. And it makes me wonder what it'll look like in another 50 years. But we've come so far with them. This is pretty basic stuff, but it is kind of important. The benefits of 911. It's an easy number to remember. In Europe, it's 999, or at least in England, it's 999. I've also read of stories because of a lot of butt dialing the emergency number because it is the same number, 999. It's kind of easy to do the same one. I think that's one reason why it's 911 instead of the same number, because it's really easy to accidentally dial that. The PSAP, or Public Safety Answering Point, has specially trained dispatchers. Many of them have, most of them have EMD training, which EMD, for those of you who don't know, is the modern systems on computer. It used to be by cards, but they put them up on a computer. The type of incident and a series of questions to be asked comes up. They type information in. If your service has a mobile CAD unit, a mobile CAD, computer-assisted dispatch, the information can be sent directly to the CAD, including step-by-step directions, previous calls to the residents, any number of things that they can be sent out. We have just so much more information than we did back in the day. We really didn't know, unless you'd been there and yourself and you remembered going to the residents, and there were some that we knew very well because we went so often. But the amount of information at your fingertips today before you ever leave the station is incredible. And it's because these telecommunicators, these trained communicators, taking down that information when they can get it, and it's not always easy to get. And of course, it's a one-stop shop. Your police, fire, EMS, the telecommunicator is going to route that call to the agencies and the proper agencies involved. And it's just easier. It's easier and more efficient to have that one number. I mentioned this earlier that cell phones have problems. We've got a lot better at finding a cell phone. Even if they don't know where they are, we can generally find them. It may take a little longer. It may take a little bit longer, but as long as we have that signal, we can usually find that phone, or at least put us in a general area. The reasons are there on your slide. They're not identified with a fixed site. Calls near geographic boundaries can go to a different PSAP. I mentioned that. It used to happen a lot, a whole lot. And it still happens today. If you're traveling somewhere and there's no guarantee that the PSAP you're going to get when you dial 911 is the one you need. This is especially a problem like at Duplin, Highway 40 ran right down the middle of the county. And we had travelers heading to the coast all the time. And they were from other states, so they didn't know where they were. All they knew is they were on Highway 40. And sometimes they weren't even in our county. But it rolled back to our PSAP. So our telecommunicators had to figure out, is this our call, or do we need to route it, which they can do instantaneously. They could immediately patch it to the right call center. But you had to figure out which the right call center was. There's some pretty humorous 911 tapes with that happening. Right now, and they have been, I remember having to deal with it when I was director at Duplin in 2015. We were dealing with FCC rules about updating the ability to triangulate and locate cell phone calls. And we got ahead of that early, so I imagine by now it's fully integrated and in place where it's much easier for us to find cell phones. I think I mentioned this earlier, the voice over IP, sending text as well as voice. It must be a standard feature. I can tell you in Duplin it is, and in most places it is by now. It must give the physical location of where the service will be used, and the provider must transmit all 911 calls to the appropriate PSAP. Because technically speaking, you get the same problem with that we need to be able to locate where these calls are coming from, and sometimes they come from outside our service area. Oh, we got another case study. This one's about Charlene. Going back to our friend. Now, you remember our friend took a header in the restaurant. Charlene, one of the waitresses in the restaurant, pulls a cell phone from the pocket and calls 911. The dispatcher immediately transfers the call to a specially trained emergency medical dispatcher, got EMD training. The EMD asks Charlene a series of questions to get help on the way, and gives her instructions for checking and monitoring Ben's condition. It'll help arrive. Now, things are going pretty much the way they should. By dialing one number, Charlene, who's gotten over the fact that she's ticked off that Ben pulled the tablecloth down and everything on it, made a mess on the floor, has got over it, and now she's called Ben some help, and the dispatcher is giving her instructions on how to help Ben. We'll come back to this. So, which of the components of the EMS system have been used so far? Well, I would argue regulations and policy have been, because we just talked about that. The FCC, the PSAP, the rules governing 911, the availability of 911, that all came from regulations from the FCC and other agencies for communications. Resource management, maybe. The only resource management that I can see that's come into play in this scenario so far is the telecommunicator telling the waitress what information to get and what steps to take to help Ben. That's kind of a slipping in the back door way of putting that, but yeah, technically I suppose it would work. Human resources and training. Well, the telecommunicators got training, had to have training to know how to work the EMD and do their job. Really hadn't got into transportation yet. Really hadn't had to worry about facilities yet. Communication, well, it kind of goes back to the 911 system. Yeah, we did use that one so far in this. Yeah, public information education. How did the waitress know to dial 911? We had to get that out there somehow. That was out there. So a little bit. That come into play a little bit. Medical direction, trauma systems evaluation, we haven't touched on those yet in this case scenario. Or maybe we have. You think about yourself, maybe you've come up with a way that we have. Well, now, EMTs Julia Smock and Peter Saylor respond to dispatch, heading down Highway 129 toward Dave's restaurant. An ancient customer holds open the front door as Julia and Peter pull up in front of the restaurant. Taking a look around the scene, the EMTs grab their equipment and head to the door. We needed some action music in the background of that one as they were doing that. What EMT responsibilities have Julie and Peter demonstrated so far? Well, for one thing, they were at their duty station, prepared to respond when the call came in. They responded apparently safely, because we aren't told they wrecked anybody or wrecked themselves, to the scene of the incident. I'm trying to think of what else they might have done. Hopefully, it didn't say, but hopefully when they went into the scene, they went in calmly with a sense of purpose that instilled confidence in the bystanders and the patient. Well, we hope they did. We don't know. It didn't say so. What EMT responsibilities you predict they will perform next? I'm not going to go there. You can think about that. You're EMT students, and I know you haven't. This is your first class, but give that a little bit of thought. I'm not going to go into it. There's a whole lot of things I could say, and I won't. That's more for you to think about. How will the EMT's appearance and action determine how they are perceived by others? Oops, let that one out of the bag. Mentioned it in the first one. Hopefully they carried themselves in such a way that people knew that help had arrived and that it was going to be, at least from their perspective, it's okay. Somebody's there to deal with this. We never tell anybody it's going to be okay unless we are absolutely sure it's going to be okay. We don't lie to people. That's something you don't want to fall in the trap of doing. Well, we'll get into more of that later. I'm not going to lecture on that right now. Types of EMS systems. I kind of messed with this earlier. I kind of mentioned it. that we've got all kinds of EMS delivery models out there, and here on this slide you see a few. But North Carolina is a third service provider in most cases. By that I mean EMS is a standalone service provided by counties, and there's a couple of municipal ones, but in other areas of the United States, fire department EMS is quite common, very common. Municipal EMS, which I mentioned, there are private agencies. There's American Medical Response, which is the largest private EMS service. And for many states, whole states, AMR is the EMS system, and they're a private company. In North Carolina, Medic is not 100%, it's private, but it has this partnership with the government. It's sort of a public-private conglomerate that provides Mecklenburg County's EMS system. It's a different model than what I'm used to, but they are technically private. So is Pender. Pender is a private service. It gets money from local government, but they are largely private. You have hospital-based systems right here in Richmond. You've got First Health, which provides the EMS services. Hospital. This is probably, I would think, the second largest type in the nation. I think fire probably runs a lot of EMS systems, and hospital-based is right up there. Law enforcement-based EMS, Maryland has some of these. Don't know whether there are specialty teams run by law enforcement that have paramedics on it, tactical paramedics or tactical medics, as part of a law enforcement team, a special operations team. I don't know of a law enforcement ran EMS system outside of Maryland. Maryland State Patrol, I think the State Patrol runs EMS there, or it did back in the day. I don't know if they still are, but I had a classmate of mine who actually went to work for them. If you remember us talking briefly about the National Scope of Practice model, one of the things it did was identified 4 levels of EMS practitioners. Of course, the EMR, the Emergency Medical Responder, the EMT, the Emergency Medical Technician, the Advanced Emergency Medical Technician, AEMT, but in North Carolina we used to call that the Intermediate, and of course the Paramedic. Those are your 4 pre-hospital recognized levels of provider. That's just an illustration of what I just told you. The hierarchy, I suppose you could call it, of EMS practitioners. I am going to stop here for part 1. I'll pick it up in part 2, where we will talk about the healthcare system. There's so much we could talk about in the healthcare system. But that's enough for part 1. Take a break before you tackle part 2, and we'll have at it again.